Hello and welcome to this video, Revising Christmas Carol, where we take a moment from the book and we have a look at what we could say about it in terms of Dickens's ideas, but also what techniques we can talk about and what connections we can make across the story. So let's start off. So the thing we're going to look at is stave 1, and we're going to look at a particular moment, and it's this moment in particular. So it's where we see Scrooge in the counting house and we have Bob Cratchit there as well. So if we just look at this bit there, now obviously assuming that you've read this before, we're just going to look at some of the things that come out of the text itself. So if we look at the start of it, it's once upon a time. So already Dickens is kind of telling us that this is a fairy tale. And with fairy tales, there's that idea of good and bad. And usually in fairy tales, what's good is clear and what's bad is clear. And so that's the kind of world that Dickens is showing us. He's not showing us a realistic world. He's showing a world where actually, good is clear and bad is clear. And so he's making that clear distinction, but also sets that tone that, this is a battle about good and bad. And by the end of a fairy tale, we always have the good winning and the bad is sorted out. And that's basically what we've got there. So you can see that there is that fairy tale element there in the story. But then also we've got this description of the weather. We've got quite a bit of description about the weather that goes into quite a bit of detail about what the fog is doing. But we've got this weather that sets the tone and the mood of the beginning of the book. And that is that there is something quite cold and quite cruel about this world. That really the cold, bleak and biting, that list of adjectives actually tells us what's the problem with society, is that it's cold, bleak meaning there's no hope, and that it's biting, that it's hurting people. And there we've got straight away that symbol of what is wrong. So society is broken. And this idea that it's not been light all day. Now, you do get it sometimes in the winter where you don't see the sun very often, but we get this sense of the combination of no light gives people no hope. And that use of the word bleak and no light tells us that, things aren't going to improve very quickly. Okay, and so we get that sense that there is something wrong, that Britain is broken at this point in the story. And then we get this little moment where we zoom into Scrooge and we see the counting house, and we've got this one opening line which describes what they're doing. But it's quite interesting, this idea that Scrooge is keeping an eye on Bob Cratchit. I know, he isn't mentioned as Bob Cratchit here, but actually that's who it is. And so we get this idea of the power situation. So Scrooge is watching, okay, and he doesn't trust it. And already we can see that this world that Dickens is creating is a very sad world. It's very cold, it's miserable, but there's a lack of trust in there. And that inference there is that, obviously Scrooge has got all the power and he's making sure that his clerk doesn't do anything wrong. But then we've also got further description of the use of word little. So we've got the idea of a little adjective, Sal, which is where he's in, and the repetition of small and smaller. Okay, so we've got this idea of size and this relationship between the two. So that obviously Bob Cratchit has the worse off in the situation. So not only has Scrooge been horrible by spying on him, but also he's got worse of everything. So he's got a small fire compared to a much smaller one that Bob has. And so Dickens is really showing us that there is a problem in society, and also he's subtly showing us that, who is the problem, and it's Scrooge, as we know from the beginning. And then we've got the little description about what does Scrooge do, what does Bob Cratchit do to kind of warm himself up. And obviously he puts a scarf on. Now, most of us know that, to try and warm yourself up, a scarf doesn't add much heat. And so actually the putting on the scarf itself is a little bit pointless, and it's a half-hearted attempt. It's not going to fix the problem. And so Dickens is showing us that, no matter what Bob does, he's not going to be able to fix it. And because he's not got anything that would make him warmer, a scarf doesn't cover everything. It's only going to warm his neck, even if it does that. So what we see here is just quite an interesting slice of the world and society. So let's have a look at why this extract's so important. It's so important as a moment in the story because it reflects how society is broken. We can see straight away, not just with the weather, but also the relationship between the employer and the employee. It shows us how money is more important than anything. So the fact that it's a counting house, obviously looking at debts and money, shows us that this world is all about money. And you can see that with the coal fire itself, is that Scrooge doesn't want to give him any more coal because that would cost him. And so you can see that everything in this capitalist society is broken because it means that people aren't happy, they're uncomfortable. But it also shows us how the rich control the poor. That Scrooge could fix this very easily by giving him some more coal, but he doesn't. All right, and so that shows you where the problem is, and it shows us how the rich hoard, so they hold on to all the resources. So in this picture here, we've got Scrooge does actually have more coal, so he could give it. It's not that he doesn't want, can't give it. He's got that potential to do it. And it shows us how vulnerable the poor are. There isn't anything much that Bob Cratchit can do in this situation, because if he says something, Scrooge will fire it and he'll lose his job, and then he won't be able to feed his children, and then he'll lose his house, and it will all have a knock-on effect. And that's what Dickens is showing us here. He shows us that there's a potential to change, and that Scrooge needs to share the coal. So this one tiny moment in the story shows us that there is potential. All right, and so a lot of people think that Scrooge is presented as this horrible character. His actions are bad, but he does become a good person. And so what Dickens is showing us is the potential to be a better world is there in the beginning. It's not suddenly magical that it happens. The potential is there. And so it is telling us this message that we can do something about it. So that's why the extract's important. And let's look at the messages. Now, one of the things that we have to be talking about when talking about A Christmas Carol is about what is Dickens's message? What is he trying to do? And so the big thing is that Dickens wants to change society. And so what this opening section shows us is it shows us how bad society is and how things are wrong. And we can see, as we've got here, the messages. We can see that the weakest and the most vulnerable are being suffering here. And we can see that obviously later with Tiny Tim. And this idea of people not being treated as humans. And this idea that the rich shouldn't prosper while the poor suffer. And underriding this is this idea that Victorian society was supposed to be Christian. What we're seeing here is not very Christian behaviour, is it? It's all about money, and it's all about protecting your own and not sharing. And so you can see that this opening moment is really powerful for that idea. So let's look at some of the things. So AO2 is talking about techniques and methods, and these could be words, it could be choices, it can be characterization. And what we've got is quite a few interesting things here that we can kind of remember or kind of make some links to later on when making some writing about it. So if we have a look, Bob Cratchit has no name at this point, so he's just known as the clerk. Now that's his job. And that kind of shows you the relationship between Scrooge and Bob Cratchit, is that he is just an employee. He's not a person. He's just known by his name. And it shows you that dehumanization of people in society that's going on, and that people are only there for themselves. They don't care about other people. They're only known by their job. We've got that motif of temperature. This is a moment in the story where things are very, very cold. That biting weather. Scrooge has been described as being cold, but we're seeing it here played out that everything is cold. And so it gives us that idea of how this world is broken and it needs to change and it needs to warm up, which is what happens at the end of the story. We've got the symbolism of fog. Now, fog is a really powerful symbol in the story because it shows if in fog you can't see things clearly. And what I'd say here is that, Scrooge is doing what he's doing, and I don't think he's doing it on purpose to be horrible, but like fog, he can't see clearly. He doesn't understand what's going on here, really. And so that symbol of the fog and not seeing things properly, that's why it's such a powerful message. And then obviously we've got those adjectives, use of size, little, small, smaller. comparative adjective there, smaller. So what we can see is this idea of the relationship between the rich and the poor is that, you know, the poor have it worse than the rich, and so this use of size helps to show us. We've also got the motif of clothes. Now, clothes are quite important in the story because good old Scrooge actually has a big coat, and when he leaves, he goes to coat. Bob Cratchit hasn't. All he's got is his scarf. And so Dickens is showing us that inequality of money through clothes very cleverly. And also we've got the use of contrasts here. So we're seeing how Scrooge contrasts with Bob Cratchit, but also we're seeing here in the story, this section contrasts with the end of the story, because at the end of the story, people are happy, it's warm, it's sunny, okay, it's not foggy, it's not cold. And so we can see that change there. So think about connecting it to other parts of the story then. So what connections can we make? So we can make a connection to Fezziwig. So when we see Fezziwig in Stave 2, we see how really an employee could be treated by their employer. And so Fezziwig is the opposite. He's showing us how it could be. And notice that we see Fezziwig after we see Scrooge, which shows us that he could be like that. That's what the model should be like. We also have this idea of Jacob Marley. Now, Jacob Marley's line, "Mankind was my business," points out to the fact that Scrooge at the start thinks money is his business. And that's what we're seeing with the coal fire, treating his employee terribly. This is what's wrong. That it's not that money was your business, it's mankind. People should be your business. And then finally, we see this new improved Scrooge right at the end. And Stave 1 and Stave 5 are opposites. We see him in his workplace and we see him in a happy relationship, and we can see that funny, joking, laughing, and it being warmer at the same time. Hopefully that's helped you. Please do check out more of our videos to see other bits of revision. Thank you.